Hello, Robert coming back at you with another video, and this is for, of course, Fat Boy Cartel podcast, Eric Hopkins and his crew, and of course my good friend and colleague, best friend in the world, Quiz Show Mike. Glad to be back again, and this time, since we were talking about old school, I wanted to talk about something near and dear to my heart, the AWA. Now, imagine for a moment that you're a 10-year-old boy and it's the in between summer and fall. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning and you're looking for something to watch on the parent satellite dish, and you run across a tag team match. And it's Playboy Buddy Rose and Pretty Boy Doug Summers against a guy named Jesse Hernandez and someone called Leon the Baby Bull White, who would later go on to be called Vader. Now, the match itself was not spectacular, but the rest of the night featured guys like Nort the Barbarian, who you might know better as the Berserker, King Kong Brody or Bruiser Brody, Boris Zukov, who was teamed up with Nikolai in the WWF, and Sergeant Slaughter. And after that episode of AWA on ESPN in 1986, I was hooked. More to the point, I was addicted, and still am. And there are a lot of people that happens to when it comes to pro wrestling, and it's because I believe that you can graft on to pro wrestling any kind of storytelling that you want it to be. Whether it's the hero's journey, tragedy, comedy, drama, action adventure, or even science fiction and fantasy, you can use professional wrestling as a tapestry for that kind of storytelling, any kind of storytelling you want. Now, the history of the AWA is something that has been well documented in other places, but essentially it was the first outlaw promotion. They began because a lot of Midwest promoters broke away from the NWA because they were sick and tired of getting shafted for the World Championship. The champion spent most of his time along the coastal territories and cities. Bigger crowds, bigger population equals bigger money, bigger payoff, and they felt they were getting screwed out of the world title. And so a bunch of their promoters, mainly a guy named Wally Carbo and a longtime NWA junior champion, Vern Gagne, decided to do a little bit of bait and switch, a little bit of chicanery with the NWA title. They declared that Pat O'Connor, the NWA champion, was the first AWA champion, and they gave him 90 days to defend that title. The NWA basically said, screw you, there's no such thing, and the AWA said, screw you too, new champion. And that was the beginning of that promotion. And a lot of territories in the Midwest and in the plain states of the country went along with the AWA. They became loyalists. Chicago in particular, and Indianapolis especially, where Dick the Bruiser ruled the roost. He was the promoter and the top star of that territory, and he was very loyal to the AWA. He got a 7-day cup of coffee with the World Championship, and he and the Crusher during the 60s and 70s were perennial AWA World Tag Team Champions. And since Indy was such a hot promotion back in the day, it was where Bobby Heenan got his start, Indy in Chicago. The AWA was quite a good competitor with the NWA, and that was before their talent roster started to age out. a lot of the guys that were big stars in the 50s, the AWA kept as stars into the 70s and even into the 80s. Bruiser and Crusher were around until at least the late 70s. Guys like Baron von Raschke, Mad Dog Vachon, and Nick Bockwinkle and Ray Stevens, they were big stars in the 60s and the 70s, and particularly Bockwinkle into the 80s was a four-time world heavyweight champion. They tried to transition the title off him many times, but it never stuck. It always went back to Bockwinkle, who was kind of like a country club golf course version, a high society version of Ric Flair. Think a mutant child of Ric Flair and William Regal, and that's Nick Bockwinkle. And he was their guy for many a year. And he was great, but he didn't fit the new concept of where everything was going. And that leads me to when I started watching the AWA, which is the era that I want to concentrate on. The basically 1984 through 1988. Those were the transition years for the AWA. It was right after they screwed things up with Hulk Hogan and sent him to the WWF with a lot of other new talent that they had. I mean, we're talking Jim Brunzell, we're talking Tito Santana, Jesse Ventura, Bobby Heenan, and a lot of other guys that were integral to the WWF becoming what it became. Now, the AWA had guys of their own that could have saved the territory, who could have saved the company, rather, but instead they didn't utilize them properly. And eventually the downward slide happened until in 1991 the AWA went into bankruptcy and was bought out by Vince McMahon, of all people. Now, this all, the talent raids happened prior to and during this transitional period. But there were still guys that were there that could have saved the promotion and who were really unsung heroes. For instance, Sergeant Slaughter. The AWA had Sergeant Slaughter as one of their main baby faces from 85 all the way up to 89 when he went to the WWF for his famous run with Hogan. We'll get to that in a second. But he was the main endorsement figure for G.I. Joe in 1986. When I started watching, I was watching G.I. Joe as a 10-year-old, and there were millions of other 10-year-olds watching G.I. Joe, and Sergeant Slaughter was in the AWA. It seems like they could have put the belt on Slaughter and rode that to success the same way the WWF was with Hogan, but Vern Gagne was a traditionalist to the point of stubbornness. He wanted his guys in technical wrestling matches with a lot of substance but no sizzle in the main event, but he would put guys like Slaughter and Jimmy Snuka, who they also had during this time, in the mid-card in order to draw crowds in but not put titles on them. Or make up titles to put on them. They called Sergeant Slaughter America's champion, and they gave him a belt to carry around that eventually Bockwinkle would wear as his world title after Stan Hansen took that beautiful big silver belt they had as a world title and ran over it and then mailed it back to him after he refused to lose the title back to Bockwinkle, but that's another story entirely. But Jimmy Snuka was also there. He was in a great feud and had a lot of heat and was one of their most high-profile guys, but Vern wouldn't put the title on him, wouldn't put any kind of emphasis on the flashy, character-driven thing that the sport was moving toward. And the Midnight Rockers. Now, I liked the Midnight Rockers. I liked the Rockers in the WWF, but I loved the Midnight Rockers in the AWA. Michaels and Jannetty without a filter, and their feud with Buddy Rose and Doug Summers in late 86 and into mid and summer and fall of 87 are just fantastic stuff, and it's all on YouTube, so go see that. Specifically their St. Paul, Minnesota Christmas night 87, well, not Christmas night 87, but St. Paul, Minnesota 1987 cage match. All four men bleed buckets, and it's Michaels and Jannetty when they were young, raw, but they were on the same level as the Rock and Roll Express, and they were having these tremendously great and energetic matches. And on house shows, they would actually close out after the world title match with 6-man tags with the Midnight Rockers and Kurt Hennig versus Rose, Summers, and whoever they picked as their partner. And those are great matches. They were great matches, but they wouldn't capitalize on them. The AWA was the meat and potatoes of professional wrestling. They had great matches with simple angles and just the basic stuff with a lot of technicality to it. And a lot of it was great. Think Ring of Honor in their early years before Sinclair, and that's what the AWA was. But in a similar way, it kind of got spoiled. It's just that Ring of Honor went too far away from their independent roots, whereas the AWA wouldn't experiment and they wouldn't move on in the direction that everything was headed, and it was a shame. And there were a lot of unsung heroes in the AWA at that time, particularly two that I want to address. Buddy Rose. Playboy Buddy Rose was a guy who was so good in the ring and as a heel on the mic that he made 2 future Hall of Famers. In Portland in the 70s, he made Rowdy Roddy Piper a star, and at this time, he made Shawn Michaels a star. I mean, the feud was the Midnight Rockers versus Buddy Rose and Doug Summers, but it was really Buddy Rose versus Shawn Michaels, and that tag team feud really launched Shawn's career, and later on it would benefit him in the WWF when he became the Heartbreak Kid. And in some of those interviews with the Midnight Rockers in the AWA, you see the prototype trying to emerge, the HBK and Shawn Michaels having its birth there. Also, Colonel De Beers, who was one of the greatest heels of the 80s. It is a shame that he is not showcased in history as much as he is. His real name was Ed Warchowski, and he started out in Portland as Buddy Rose's partner, but when he went to the AWA, he started this pro-apartheid mercenary military guy, a thing that you couldn't do today. You'd get arrested, canceled, shot if you did this thing, because Colonel De Beers was specifically a white supremacist. He would complain about the referee or his opponent not being white and him not wanting to sully his hands by participating in the match, and it got him so much heat. And a lot of what Sergeant Slaughter did in his feud with Hogan in 1990-91 has a lot to do with the feud between Sergeant Slaughter and Colonel De Beers in the AWA. It was transverse the other direction. A lot of that was lifted for the Hogan feud later. And I've always wondered if Colonel De Beers, if that character had been tweaked a little bit, that maybe Colonel De Beers versus Hulk Hogan would have been the main event of WrestleMania 7 and what that would have done. Might have been worse because Slaughter was a household name and De Beers wasn't, but then again, I would have loved to have seen it. Now, the reason that it failed was because, like I said, they wouldn't embrace the new style. They tried to a little bit. In 1985, the first Super Clash was put on by Pro Wrestling USA, which was an NWA AWA co-op. The first Super Clash had some great matches in it. Night of Champions in Chicago. And there were NWA and AWA guys on the card, and it was packed full. But then the next year, Super Clash 2, you could start to see the downward spiral because the AWA couldn't maintain those relationships. Super Clash 3, also from Chicago, featured another co-promotional thing. And a lot of people say that Super Clash 3 sucked, but when you watch it again compared to other things, and because of the star power that is the people that developed into Legends later, it's actually a much better card than it lets on to be. And the AWA, through that partnership, could have survived, and the USWA that resulted would have been a lot bigger, and I got that from no greater authority than one half of the main event of Super Clash 3, Jerry Lawler himself. I met him at StarCast 2, and I asked him about this event and whether it was all Vern Gagne's fault that it fell apart, and he said no, it wasn't Vern Gagne's fault entirely. Nobody could make a decision that day. But because that show failed to make a profit, and people have called it the iceberg to the AWA's Titanic, the promotion unfortunately died. But the AWA, when it was hot, was fantastic. And when it was transitioning, it had such bright moments, and it was part of what made me fall in love with professional wrestling. Now, I love history, especially wrestling history, because the past is prologue. If you understand what has happened in the past, it helps you to understand the present and what may be in the future if people don't learn the mistakes. And right now, I'd say that after this weekend, after you compare the All Out pay-per-view to the SummerSlam pay-per-view, it becomes obvious that those lessons have not been learned, and that Vince McMahon is falling into the same trap as his former competitor. He's getting Vern Gagne syndrome, which is what I call it when somebody refuses to transition to the next level, and I think that's what's happening with WWE. But the AWA did it first. Now, if you're interested in the AWA, I suggest that you go to YouTube and check out a lot of especially the older stuff from the AWA is really dynamic. First, check out AWA, the Untold History of the Territories, and that will tell you all of the backstory about how the AWA started and its title origins and all that. The Glory Days of Pro Wrestling by Willie J. That's a channel you need to check out. There's several episodes of real good stuff. Not all of it AWA, but a lot of it is. And there are house shows on that channel and in that series of stuff that I've never seen before. And it's an ongoing series, real good stuff. Also, a good illustration of what I'm talking about is an event called AWA Battle at the Bay. And that's completely on YouTube, the whole event. And it features the absolute worst Jimmy Snuka match I have ever seen in my entire life. It's so god-awful horrible that it's comic. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm endorsing the match, but there's a lot of good stuff in Battle by the Bay, a lot of exciting stuff, particularly the main event, that you need to check out because it illustrates the transition from the stuff that didn't work with the AWA and the stuff that did, and the direction they should have gone but did not, and were hindered by Vince McMahon's talent rates. Also, all three of the Super Clashes are on YouTube. Check those out, especially the first one, Super Clash 85, Night of Champions. Great stuff. It's not as fast-paced as today's stuff, but if you like old-school technical wrestling, that is a great example of all that. It's got AWA guys, NWA guys, legends all around. And Wrestle Rock 86. The last great hurrah of the AWA, but for the love of God, for the sake of all that is holy, do not listen to, fast forward past the god-awful Wrestle Rock Rumble. Your ears will bleed and your soul will be wounded. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about old school, wanted to talk about the AWA. The Fat Boy Cartel podcast. Like, subscribe, and share. And this is Robert. Hope you enjoyed this video. Signing off.
Target